Ever since Wade moved in with me, the rhythm of my life shifted. My one-bedroom apartment in Austin had always felt spacious enough for me, but now every corner was a reminder of him, his easy laugh echoing down the hallway, his sneakers kicked off by the door, the faint scent of his cologne drifting through the air like a quiet question I wasn't sure I wanted to answer. Wade was my cousin, technically, but we'd grown up like brothers. When we were kids, we used to spend summers at our grandparents' house, racing each other up the wooden stairs and collapsing in fits of laughter on the porch. Back then, it was all about water balloon fights and whispered secrets. But life got in the way: college, work, the endless distractions of adulthood, and our connection faded into an occasional text or social media like. So when Wade called a month ago asking if he could crash with me for a while, I said yes before I could even think about it. He showed up with 2 duffel bags and that easy smile of his, like he'd just rolled out of a sunbeam. Wade had always been the more laid-back one, the kind of guy who made friends without trying, who never seemed to worry about what other people thought. He worked in marketing, something to do with branding campaigns and pitches I didn't fully understand. He said the new job was exciting, but his voice had a cautious edge when he talked about it, like he was trying to convince himself along with me. The first night he arrived, we stayed up late talking on the couch. He sprawled out in his usual effortless way, arms behind his head, while I perched on the armrest, fidgeting with the drawstring on my sweatpants. We laughed about old memories, like the time we got lost in the woods behind our grandma's house and had to be rescued by her old golden retriever. I'd forgotten how easy it was to talk to him, how quickly he could make the world feel softer. But even then, I could sense something different in the way my chest tightened whenever he smiled at me. It wasn't just nostalgia. There was a warmth in the pit of my stomach that I tried to dismiss as nothing more than cousinly affection, but it felt like something more, something I wasn't ready to name. Living with Wade was like inviting the sun into my apartment. He had this way of making everything feel brighter. He'd crack jokes while we made breakfast, toss me a towel when I forgot mine after a shower, and settle into the couch with me at the end of the day like it was the most natural thing in the world. At first, it was comforting, familiar. But the longer he was here, the more I noticed the way his laughter stuck in my head like a catchy song, or how I found myself replaying his words in the quiet moments before bed. He didn't seem to notice the way I was changing around him. Or maybe he did, and he was too polite to say anything. Sometimes, when I caught him glancing at me in the kitchen, I'd wonder if he was thinking the same thing I was. But then he'd grin and toss me a spatula like nothing was different, and I'd shove the thought back into the corner of my mind where it belonged. I kept telling myself it was just a phase, a trick of the light, but the truth was, I was starting to crave his presence in ways I didn't understand. It wasn't just that he was handsome, tall, with that tousled brown hair, and the kind of smile that could talk you into anything. It was that he made me feel seen. And I'd never realized how much I needed that. On the third night, we ended up binge-watching some old sitcom reruns, half-eaten bowls of popcorn between us. He stretched out his legs and nudged me with his foot every time he laughed at a joke, his casual touches sending sparks up my spine. When the credits rolled and he turned to me with a sleepy grin, I realized that I never wanted this moment to end. But I also knew that what I was feeling wasn't supposed to happen. Wade was family, he was supposed to be off-limits. I told myself it was just the novelty of living together again, like some kind of regression to those childhood summers. But even then, my heart knew better. I tried to distract myself with work, long hours at my graphic design firm, late nights tweaking logos until my eyes burned. But when I came home and found Wade humming in the kitchen, barefoot and focused on making dinner, all the distractions melted away. He had this habit of narrating everything he did, turning the mundane into a kind of performance. "Carter, you're gonna love this sauce, trust me," he'd say, and I'd watch him move around the kitchen with effortless confidence, my pulse ticking up in ways I couldn't control. At night, I'd lie in bed listening to him move around in the next room, the soft creak of the floorboards, the quiet click of the light switch. And I'd wonder if he could hear my heartbeat pounding through the wall, if he was awake too, thinking about me the way I was thinking about him. I didn't know how to handle it, this growing ache, this impossible tenderness. I told myself it was temporary, that once Wade found his own place, things would go back to normal. But deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted normal anymore. I wasn't sure what I wanted, except that it had everything to do with him. One morning, as we sat side by side on the couch, Wade nudged me with his shoulder and said, "I'm glad I'm here, you know? I didn't realize how much I missed you until I got here." His voice was soft, the kind of softness that made my chest tighten. I forced a smile and said I was glad too, but the words tasted bittersweet. He leaned back, his head resting on the cushion, eyes half closed in that lazy way of his. "Feels like old times, huh?" he murmured. "Yeah," I said, and I let the word hang in the air between us, thick with everything I wasn't ready to say. It felt like old times, but it also felt like something new, something I couldn't ignore, no matter how hard I tried. As the sun dipped below the skyline and the city lights flickered on outside our window, I knew one thing for sure. Ever since Wade moved in with me, my whole world had shifted. And I couldn't tell if that was the best thing that had ever happened to me, or the most dangerous. Wade settled into my apartment like he'd always belonged there, weaving his presence into every corner. At first, it was little things. The way he always left the blinds open so the sunlight could pour in, how he'd leave his coffee cup in the sink with a half smile and a promise to clean it later. But soon, it became everything. My apartment felt smaller with him here, but also brighter, warmer. As if he'd brought a piece of summer with him, and it refused to fade. Every morning, we moved around each other in the cramped kitchen like we'd choreographed it, him flipping pancakes while I fumbled with the coffee maker, trading sarcastic comments and half-sincere apologies when we bumped shoulders. I liked the way he'd lean over the counter, elbows propped up as he watched me. There was something almost too intimate about the way he held my gaze, but I pretended it was nothing. It had to be nothing. I'd catch myself staring at him sometimes, tracing the curve of his jaw or the way the morning light caught the flecks of gold in his hair. I'd scold myself, force my eyes back to my plate, but it was like trying to turn away from the sun. Wade had always been good-looking, but it was different now, grown up in a way that made my chest tighten. It wasn't just how he looked, it was how he carried himself, the easy way he filled a room. Like he belonged there. Like he belonged with me. He was still job hunting, settling into the marketing job, but waiting on the final paperwork. Some days, he'd spend hours sprawled across the couch, his laptop balanced on his knees, half distracted by whatever playlist he'd found online. I'd come home from work and find him like that, legs stretched out, head bobbing to the music, and my throat would tighten at the sight of him. I'd tell myself it was just because it felt like old times, two kids playing house, even if we were both pretending not to see how it was different now. We started cooking together in the evenings, sharing a single cutting board and elbowing each other over who got to use the sharp knife. I'd steal glances at him when I thought he wasn't looking, catching the easy way he smiled at nothing at all. He had a habit of narrating every step like it was a cooking show. "Watch and learn, Carter," he'd say, slicing vegetables with a flourish. "This is how you dice an onion without crying." I'd laugh, pushing him lightly with my hip. "I'm not the one who cries every time we watch those sappy movies," I'd tease. And he'd roll his eyes, but his cheeks would flush just a little. Some nights, we'd sit on the balcony with beers in hand, watching the city breathe beneath us. Wade liked to lean back in his chair, ankles crossed, eyes half closed against the glow of the streetlights. He'd talk about his plans, how he wanted to explore the city, maybe find a band to play with on weekends. Music had always been his thing. He'd tap his fingers against the railing like he was drumming out a beat only he could hear. One night, he turned to me and said, "You ever feel like you're stuck between who you used to be and who you're supposed to be?" His voice was soft, almost lost to the hum of traffic below. I looked at him, surprised by the sudden vulnerability. "Yeah," I said honestly. "All the time." He didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, eyes thoughtful, and then he nodded like that was enough. Like he understood without needing to say more. I started to notice how my feelings were shifting in those quiet moments. How my laughter lingered a little longer when he was around. How the air felt charged when our shoulders brushed. He'd flop onto the couch next to me, his arm pressed against mine, and I'd freeze for half a second before I could pretend it didn't matter. But it did. Every touch, every look, it mattered more than I wanted to admit. It was like we were both dancing around something neither of us wanted to name. He'd smile at me, and I'd feel it like a secret pressed into my skin. He'd lean over to grab the remote, his breath warm on my cheek, and I'd have to swallow hard to keep my pulse steady. I tried to talk to my best friend, Jalen, about it once. Over coffee on a Saturday morning, I told him, "It's weird having Wade here. It feels different." Jalen raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" I shrugged, staring into my cup. "I don't know. Like I'm seeing him for the first time, but he's always been there." Jalen watched me for a moment, then said carefully, "Just be honest with yourself. Don't let it eat you up." And I nodded, even though I wasn't sure how to do that. Being honest felt dangerous. It felt like stepping off a ledge with no idea if the ground would catch me. One night, after a long day at work, I came home to find Wade in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up and music playing softly from his phone. He looked up as I walked in, his smile easy and warm. "I made pasta," he said. "Hope that's okay." I nodded, my throat tight.
"Yeah."
"That's perfect." We ate together, the conversation easy and familiar. But under the words, there was a tension, like a string pulled taut between us, humming with every glance, every half-smile. When we cleaned up afterward, his hand brushed mine, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow down to that single point of contact. I pulled back, my heart hammering. "I'll finish the dishes," I said, my voice a little too steady. He watched me for a moment, his expression unreadable, and then he nodded. "Okay." That night, I lay in bed, listening to the quiet sounds of the apartment. Wade's breathing, slow, and even in the next room. The city outside, alive and restless. I wanted to knock on his door, to ask him if he felt it too. The way the air seemed to crackle between us, the way my thoughts kept circling back to him no matter how hard I tried to push them away. But I didn't. Instead, I closed my eyes and let the feeling settle in my chest, warm and frightening all at once. Because ever since Wade moved in with me, everything had changed. And I wasn't sure if I was ready to face what that meant, but I knew I couldn't keep pretending it wasn't real. I could feel it building, the tension between Wade and me, like the air itself was holding its breath. Every time he brushed past me in the kitchen, every time he laughed and his eyes met mine, it was another stitch in a fabric I was terrified to tear. I didn't know how to admit it to myself, let alone to him. Jalen noticed before I did. He came over on a Saturday afternoon, dropping onto the couch and glancing between Wade and me as if he could see the invisible thread tying us together. "You two seem close," he said, a teasing edge in his voice that didn't quite cover the curiosity. Wade just grinned, oblivious. "We're family, man. Been close since we were kids." I forced a laugh, but my hands felt clammy.
"Yeah."
Just like old times. But it wasn't just like old times, and Jalen's raised eyebrow told me he knew it too. After Wade disappeared into his room to take a call, Jalen leaned over, voice low. "Carter, if you're into him, you've got to figure it out. You're not going to be able to keep pretending." "I'm not." I lied, my voice cracking on the word. I knew how pathetic it sounded. Jalen didn't push. He just clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Just be careful with yourself, okay?" That night, Wade and I ended up sprawled across the couch again, some old comedy playing on mute while we both scrolled through our phones. His foot rested against mine, a casual touch that made it hard to breathe. I told myself not to read into it, but it felt like a promise, like he was saying, "I'm here with you, even if we're not saying it out loud." The next night, after a couple of beers, we watched another old movie, something we'd seen 100 times as kids. Wade rested his head against the back of the couch, his body slouching closer with every scene. I could smell his shampoo, feel the heat radiating off him. My heart pounded in my chest like a warning bell. When the credits rolled, he didn't move away. Instead, he turned his head slightly, his breath warm against my neck. "You remember when we used to stay up all night watching these?" he asked softly. "Yeah," I said, my voice rough. "Feels like a lifetime ago." He hummed, his eyes tracing my face. "It doesn't feel that long ago to me." For a second, I thought he was going to say something more. I could almost feel the words between us, hanging in the silence like a fragile bridge. But then he smiled, quick and easy, and pushed himself up off the couch. "I'm gonna head to bed," he said, stretching in a way that drew my eyes to the lines of his arms. "Night, Carter." "Night," I managed, though the word felt like a stone in my throat. When he was gone, I stayed on the couch, staring at the dark screen. I felt like I was on the edge of something I'd spent years denying. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure if I wanted to step back from it or dive in headfirst. The next morning, everything felt off. Wade was quiet, his usual chatter muted. He moved around the kitchen with a distracted air, eyes flicking to me and away again too quickly. I wanted to ask him what he was thinking, but I was too afraid of the answer. By the time evening rolled around, the tension was thick enough to taste. We were cleaning up after dinner, our shoulders bumping as we moved around each other. He reached for a dish at the same time I did, our hands colliding. We both froze. "I'll get it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "No, I got it," he said, just as softly. Our eyes met, and in that moment, something cracked open. My breath caught, my heart hammering so loud I was sure he could hear it. And before I could talk myself out of it, the words slipped out. "Wade." I swallowed, feeling my whole world tilt. "I think I might feel something for you." He went very still, the dish in his hand forgotten. His eyes searched mine, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything. The air felt electric, like a storm waiting to break. Finally, he set the dish down and leaned back against the counter. "Carter," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "We can't just throw that out there and pretend it doesn't matter." "I know," I said, my mouth dry. "I've been trying to ignore it, but it's there. I can't pretend it's not anymore." He let out a slow breath, his eyes shuttered. "This isn't something we can just brush off. We're family." "I know," I repeated, though it felt like the words were scraping against my ribs. "But I can't help how I feel." He didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, his expression a mix of confusion and something else, something that looked a lot like the fear I felt. "I need to think about this," he said finally. "I need to figure out what this means." "Okay," I said, my voice barely steady. "I get it." We didn't talk much for the rest of the night. He retreated to his room, and I stayed in the living room, staring at the glow of the city outside the window. My thoughts felt like a carousel I couldn't get off, spinning around the same questions, the same ache in my chest. I knew I'd crossed a line, but I didn't regret it. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I'd stopped pretending. Like I was finally breathing air I'd been holding in too long. But I also knew that things wouldn't be the same now. Wade and I had always been close, but this was something new. Something dangerous, and impossibly hopeful all at once. When I finally went to bed, I lay awake for hours, listening to the quiet sounds of the apartment. I wondered if Wade was lying awake too, if he was replaying our conversation in his head like I was. I wondered if he felt the same impossible longing I did, or if he was already trying to find a way to close the door I'd just flung open. I didn't have any answers. All I knew was that nothing about this was simple, and somehow that only made me want him more. Wade and I spent the next few days in a careful dance of avoidance, skirting around each other like we were both afraid of setting off a landmine. He'd come into the kitchen while I was making coffee and murmur a quick morning, his eyes darting to the floor before he disappeared back to his room. I'd hear his laughter through the wall when he was on the phone with someone, but when we were alone, there was nothing but brittle silence. I tried to keep busy, poured myself into work, spent long hours at the office, so I wouldn't have to be in the apartment. When I did come home, I'd find him on the couch with his laptop or sprawled across the bed, pretending to read. We talked about groceries and rent, and nothing that mattered. And every time our eyes met, there was this charged pause, like we both wanted to say something, but didn't know how to begin. One night, I came home late to find him in the kitchen, the only light coming from the stove's overhead lamp. He was making tea, his hair messy and his shoulders hunched. When he saw me, he straightened up, his eyes shadowed. "Hey," I said softly, setting my keys on the counter. "Couldn't sleep?" He shrugged, staring into his mug.
Yeah.
"Just a lot on my mind." "Me too," I admitted, my voice so quiet it felt like a confession. "I don't know what to do, Wade. I don't know how to make this okay." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow sip of his tea, his eyes fixed on a spot just past my shoulder. "Carter," he said finally, his voice low and careful, "I've been thinking about what you said, and I don't know how to feel." My chest tightened. "It's okay if you don't feel the same," I said quickly, even though the words tasted like ash. "I just needed you to know how I feel." I couldn't keep it inside anymore. Wade set his mug down and leaned back against the counter, folding his arms across his chest. "It's not that I don't feel something," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "It's that I don't know what to do with it.
I don't know if we're supposed to cross that line."
"I know," I said, my heart thudding in my chest. "But I can't help what I feel. And I don't think you can either." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment, the air between us felt electric. "You're right," he said finally. "I can't pretend I don't feel something too. But I don't know what that means for us." I took a step closer, my hands shaking. "Maybe we don't have to figure it out all at once," I said. "Maybe we just take it one step at a time." Wade hesitated, his eyes searching mine. Then he let out a slow breath and gave a small, almost helpless smile. "One step at a time," he repeated, as if testing the words. I nodded, my throat tight.
"Yeah."
For a moment, we just stood there in the kitchen, the hum of the fridge the only sound. I wanted to reach for him, to close the distance between us, but I didn't. I was too afraid of pushing too hard, too fast. So, I just let the moment settle, let it be enough. The next morning felt easier somehow. We moved around each other in the kitchen without that brittle tension, our shoulders brushing lightly as we made breakfast. He made a dumb joke about how my coffee tasted like dishwater, and I laughed, the sound almost a relief. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like a start. Over the next week, we settled into a new rhythm, talking more, testing the waters of whatever this was becoming. Wade started opening up in small ways, telling me about his worries, his hopes. I listened, soaking up every word, every glance. And I let myself hope that maybe we were building something real, even if we didn't know what to call it. One night, we were watching a movie on the couch, and Wade shifted closer until our shoulders were pressed together. I could feel the warmth of him, the way his arm brushed against mine. My pulse quickened, but I didn't move away.
I didn't want to.
He leaned his head back against the couch and turned to me, his eyes soft. "You ever think about what would have happened if we'd figured this out sooner?" he asked. I swallowed hard.
"Yeah."
"All the time." He nodded slowly. I think I would have been too scared back then." "Me too," I said, my voice catching. "But I'm not scared now." He smiled, a small, crooked smile that made my chest ache. "Neither am I," he said, his fingers brushing against mine, lingering there like a promise. We didn't kiss. We didn't need to. In that moment, it felt like everything was finally out in the open, like the weight we'd been carrying had finally lifted. Later that night, I lay in bed, listening to the quiet sounds of the apartment. I thought about how far we'd come, how the fear and confusion had given way to something softer, something that felt like hope. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid to find out. I could hear Wade moving around in his room, the faint creak of the floorboards, the quiet hum of his voice as he talked to someone on the phone. It was comforting, familiar, and it felt like home.
I knew we still had a lot to figure out.
There were questions we hadn't even begun to ask, feelings we hadn't fully unpacked. But in that moment, I felt sure of one thing. I wasn't alone in this. Wade was here with me, and that was enough. As I drifted off to sleep, I let that thought settle in my chest like an anchor. One step at a time, I reminded myself. One step at a time.